Her husband said she was a burden at his company dinner. Then, she walked back into the room. Natalie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the neckline of the only formal dress she owned. It wasn't flashy, just a navy blue piece she bought on clearance years ago for a cousin's wedding. Her husband, Philip, walked into the bedroom while adjusting his cufflinks and raised an eyebrow at her appearance. "That's what you're wearing?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost uninterested. Natalie nodded, trying to suppress the unease rising in her chest. He didn't offer a compliment or a reassuring word, only added, "Don't make this night about you. This is important for my career." She swallowed hard and nodded again, as she always did. The dinner was a celebration hosted by Philip's firm, a company full of polished, well-dressed professionals and their equally polished spouses. Natalie had never been invited before, despite being married to Philip for 6 years. He always said it was more of a networking event and that it wouldn't be her kind of crowd. This time, though, with Philip's name being floated for a promotion, the company wanted families to join, to show the firm's human side. Natalie knew she didn't fit the mold. She wasn't a lawyer, a consultant, or an investor's daughter. She was just Natalie, a former librarian who hadn't worked in 3 years since the local library shut down. But tonight, she told herself, she'd just smile, nod, and get through it. The venue was breathtaking, crystal chandeliers, velvet-lined chairs, and waiters gliding past with champagne. Natalie felt immediately out of place. The room sparkled, not just from the decor, but from the women who floated around in couture gowns and designer heels. Their hair and makeup were flawless, their conversations punctuated with terms like portfolio growth, hedge fund strategies, and estate renovations. Philip slipped away to talk to his coworkers, leaving Natalie alone at their table. She tried not to let her hands fidget with the linen napkin in her lap as she felt the occasional glance sweep over her, assessing, dismissing. 2 women sat down at the table beside her. One leaned toward the other, whispering just loud enough for Natalie to hear. "I guess Philip brought Charity tonight," she said with a half-smile, eyes fixed on Natalie's dress. The other woman giggled behind her wine glass. Natalie felt her ears burn, but she kept her head high. She reached for her glass of water, pretending not to hear, though their words looped endlessly in her head. She had imagined being invisible, but this felt worse. She wasn't ignored, she was being observed, judged, and ranked. And she was failing miserably. Later in the evening, the host, Philip's manager, rose for a toast, clinking his glass with a spoon. The room fell quiet. To a year of growth, new partnerships, and, hopefully, new leadership, he smiled, glancing at Philip. The guests chuckled in approval. Philip stood, thanked the team, and added a few remarks. Then, with a grin that Natalie had seen many times, his watch this grin, he motioned toward her. "And thank you to my lovely wife, Natalie, for joining us tonight. She's not exactly corporate material, but she's been keeping the couch warm while I chase the dream." Laughter erupted across the room. Natalie froze. It wasn't just the joke. It was the way he said it. Like she was a side note. A burden. Her throat tightened. She forced a smile and looked down at her plate, the tips of her fingers pressing into the fabric of her napkin. The laughter lingered a bit too long. Philip continued his speech, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the sting of his words. Natalie's vision blurred. The music returned. People resumed chatting, but the sting didn't fade. She had come to support him. She had come to be part of his world. And he had made her the punchline. After dinner, Philip introduced Natalie to a few of his colleagues. One man asked what she did, and before she could respond, Philip jumped in. "She's in early retirement," he smirked. "Married a breadwinner and never looked back." His friends laughed again. Natalie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She could feel something closing in her chest. Her face burned, her hands trembled slightly. She excused herself politely and walked away, leaving her husband mid-conversation. She didn't look back. She didn't want to see if he even noticed she was gone. Natalie made her way through the hallway toward the restroom, but instead of going in, she kept walking. Down the corridor, past the ballroom doors, out into the night. The cold air hit her skin like a slap. She stood beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights, her breath visible in the winter air. Her eyes welled up with tears she had been holding back for hours. Behind her, laughter floated out from the ballroom. She had never felt smaller. Her husband, her partner, had torn her down in front of everyone. And not a single person had stepped in. She leaned against the wall, arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Something had cracked deep inside her, and she knew it would never go back to the way it was. Natalie called for a cab, not caring that it was early, not even bothering to tell Philip. As the car pulled up, she gave the driver her address and slid into the back seat, numb. She sat in silence as the city passed by in streaks of amber light. The quiet hum of the car and the low murmur of the radio were the only sounds. The driver didn't speak, and Natalie was grateful. She didn't want to explain why she was leaving a black tie event alone, in a borrowed coat, her heels tucked beside her. She just wanted to disappear. When she arrived home, she stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual. She looked around at the bedroom they shared, the framed photos, the books untouched on her nightstand, the wedding picture that now seemed like a stranger's life. She stared at her reflection in the mirror again. Same dress. Same face. But something was different now. Something inside her had shifted. That night wasn't just a humiliation. It was a breaking point. For the first time in years, Natalie felt something awaken, quiet but firm. A part of her that had been buried beneath years of compromise and silence. The next morning, Philip acted as though nothing had happened. He poured coffee, scrolled through his phone, and asked Natalie if she wanted eggs. She simply shook her head and mumbled that she wasn't hungry. He didn't seem to notice the dullness in her voice or the stiffness in her body. That's how it had become, years of her fading into the background while he flourished. Somewhere along the line, she had gone from partner to shadow, from wife to silent supporter. And she had allowed it, brushing away every sting with a smile until the bruises became invisible even to herself. Natalie spent most of that day in their guest room, a place she had never really used. She sat by the window with a notebook she hadn't opened in years. Flipping through it, she saw sketches, outlines, even rough financial notes from a time when she had dreams, when she had thought about starting a reading app for underprivileged communities. Her passion for books had never faded, but her sense of possibility had. She remembered how she used to study funding models, nonprofit partnerships, and pitch structures. Now, all of that lay buried beneath dinners, laundry, and years of diminished worth. She ran her fingers across the faded ink and whispered to herself, "I used to matter." Later that week, Natalie went to the local park to clear her mind. The cold breeze bit at her cheeks, but the fresh air felt like something she could finally breathe in deeply. As she sat near a quiet bench, she watched children playing and felt a strange blend of sadness and peace. It was as though life kept moving, but she had paused years ago. She thought about Philip's words at the dinner, not just the ones from last night, but the subtle cuts over the years, the comments about how she had it easy, how she wouldn't survive in the real world, or how her cute little book ideas weren't worth pursuing. When she returned home, she opened her laptop for the first time in months. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of where to start. Out of instinct, she typed free business courses for beginners. Dozens of resources popped up: Harvard modules, nonprofit accelerator programs, even startup webinars. Her heart began to beat faster. Something inside her stirred, not fear, but curiosity. She created an anonymous username and signed up for one course. Just one. She didn't tell Philip. She didn't need him to know. For the first time in a long while, this was hers and hers alone. 2 weeks later, while shopping for groceries, Natalie bumped into a familiar face in the produce aisle. It was Elena, a former college friend she hadn't seen in almost a decade. Elena had always been full of ambition, with a sharp mind and infectious energy. They hugged awkwardly but warmly, and Natalie found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. As they caught up over coffee in the store's cafe, Elena mentioned that she worked in venture capital, specifically in a fund that invested in women-led initiatives with social impact. Natalie hesitated, then confessed she had been dabbling in business courses, trying to find herself again. Elena leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you thinking about doing?" Natalie hesitated but pulled out her notebook, the old one with faded pages. She showed her friend the app concept from years ago: affordable, curated digital libraries for underserved schools and families. Elena's eyes lit up. "This is good. Really good," she said. "I'd love to help you polish it and maybe even connect you to a few people." Natalie almost laughed. The idea of someone taking her seriously after so long felt unreal. But Elena wasn't joking. And in that moment, a part of Natalie, the part that had once dared to dream, began to breathe again. That night, Natalie stayed up until well past midnight, revisiting every note she had ever written, cross-referencing resources, scribbling new ideas. It was like meeting a younger version of herself, one full of clarity and boldness. She hadn't felt that way in years. When Philip asked what she was doing so late, she said she couldn't sleep. He grunted something unintelligible and turned off his bedside lamp. Natalie didn't mind. She had long stopped expecting encouragement from him. The quiet between them had become the norm. But this silence was different. This silence was hers. It was focused, alive, and humming with possibility. She began allocating her days carefully. Mornings were for housework and obligations. Afternoons were for study, research, and drafting her proposal. She worked from the library sometimes, saying she needed a change of scenery. Philip didn't ask questions. Natalie didn't offer explanations. As she pieced together her pitch deck and reviewed competitor analyses, she could almost see it coming together. Elena checked in often, giving feedback and encouragement. "You're sharper than half the founders I meet," she'd say. Natalie didn't know if it was true. But she held on to those words like oxygen. 2 months after their reunion, Elena invited Natalie to a small event for aspiring female founders. It wasn't glamorous, a simple co-working space with mismatched chairs and free coffee, but to Natalie, it felt like a cathedral. The women in the room shared stories of failure and perseverance, of balancing kids and careers, of rebuilding after loss. Natalie shared her idea hesitantly, but the nods and follow-up questions surprised her. People didn't just hear her, they listened. A woman from an education nonprofit asked to follow up. a grand advisor gave her a card. For the first time, Natalie's voice wasn't background noise. It was something people leaned in to hear. When she got home that night, Philip was already in bed. She sat on the edge, not to wake him, but because she needed a moment. Her heart raced, not with fear, but exhilaration. The road ahead was still foggy, and she had no guarantees. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't asking to be seen. She was moving, step by step, towards something entirely her own. And she wasn't going to stop. Natalie found herself rummaging through boxes in the attic, searching for old documents to support her pitch. Among the dusty textbooks and outdated electronics, she uncovered a leather-bound journal. Inside were pages filled with ideas she'd scribbled years ago, diagrams, goals, and reflections. One entry read, "One day, I'll build something that helps those like me, quiet people who never got a chance to speak." The words hit her like a wave. She had nearly forgotten that version of herself, the one who believed in change. Holding that journal, she felt the echoes of a younger Natalie reach out from the past. She carefully copied some of the old sketches into her digital files, updating them with her new knowledge. The core idea remained: access to curated reading tools for low-income families. But now, she added a revenue stream, metrics for engagement, and possible partnerships with libraries. As the model grew more detailed, so did her belief. It wasn't just an emotional mission anymore. It was becoming a real, scalable business. And every number, every paragraph in her proposal, was stitched together with years of silent learning and invisible resilience. 2 weeks later, Elena called with urgency in her voice. One of the venture partners at her firm had agreed to hear Natalie's concept. It wasn't a formal pitch, it was a 10-minute coffee chat. But to Natalie, it felt like standing at the edge of something huge. She spent 3 sleepless nights preparing. Her slides were sharp, her speaking notes tight, and her narrative precise. When the morning came, she wore her best outfit, tied her hair neatly, and arrived early. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the portfolio. The meeting took place in a quiet downtown cafe. The investor, a woman named Raquel, listened intently as Natalie spoke. "This isn't just about books," she said firmly. "It's about restoring dignity through access to knowledge." Raquel didn't smile or nod at first, she just watched. Then, after a pause, she leaned back and said, "You're not what I expected." Natalie's stomach dropped. But then Raquel added, "You're better." She asked for a full business plan and scheduled a follow-up. Natalie walked out into the afternoon sun, feeling like the world had shifted slightly in her favor for the first time in years. At home, life remained eerily the same. Philip still came home late, still talked about office politics and upcoming promotions, and still treated her presence as furniture. "Busy with your little project again?" he asked one evening, not looking up from his laptop. Natalie simply smiled. She didn't feel the need to explain anymore. His words didn't sting like they once did. She had grown beyond the reach of his ridicule. Her mind was focused on projections, engagement strategies, and timelines. His dismissiveness no longer distracted her. She had entered a different world, one where her mind had purpose again. And yet, she saw the irony of it all. While she expanded her vision in silence, Philip's world began to wobble. He complained about instability at the firm, about foreign investors getting cold feet. Natalie listened quietly, nodding at the right moments. She knew that change was coming. But she said nothing. Not yet. Her revenge wasn't anger or retaliation. It was becoming the version of herself he never thought she could be. The second meeting with Raquel went better than Natalie had imagined. She brought in data, testimonials from local teachers, and even a small video clip she recorded with families who had tested her prototype. Raquel's team asked pointed questions, and Natalie answered each one with grace. When they offered her a modest initial investment to build out a beta version, she nearly cried, but didn't. She shook hands, signed the terms, and walked out with the paperwork neatly tucked in her folder. Her hands trembled with joy, not fear. This was real. She was building something that mattered. Elena called her that night, voice bubbling with excitement. "I told you," she said. "You belong in this space." Natalie laughed, curled up on the couch with her laptop open. Her mind buzzed with to-do lists, hiring needs, legal forms, and back-end design. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. But it was hers. She didn't need validation anymore. She had something better, momentum. And that, for the first time in a long time, made her feel whole. By late spring, Natalie had assembled a tiny team, 2 freelance developers, 1 educational consultant, and a designer who worked nights. They met over video calls, shared files in cloud folders, and worked in bursts around their jobs. The prototype came together slowly, but beautifully. Clean interface, bilingual support, hand-picked collections for students and parents. Natalie stayed up late tweaking the reading levels and feedback loops. Every detail mattered to her. Every click, every swipe, needed to feel thoughtful. She wasn't just building a product, she was creating a bridge to dignity. When the beta was ready, she scheduled a test with a nearby community center. Children used the app with excitement, parents smiled in surprise at the quality of the experience. A local teacher said, "This could change how we support our students." Natalie smiled through the feedback session, taking notes, thanking everyone. But when she got home that night, she let herself cry, quiet, grateful tears. No one in that room had known her past, or the humiliation she had swallowed. They just saw her work. And they believed in it. That was enough. Philip came home one evening with his tie loosened and shoulders slumped. He barely touched his dinner and kept glancing at his phone. "Everything all right?" Natalie asked, keeping her tone neutral. "It's nothing," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed the anxiety. Over the next few days, he was on edge, pacing during calls, muttering about board decisions and unpredictable partners. Natalie understood more than he knew. From her own quiet research, she had learned that his firm was facing uncertainty. A major investor, one with control, was considering pulling out due to internal conflicts. Natalie said nothing, but inside, the pieces were aligning. She knew the investor group involved. Through her pitch process, she had seen a familiar name tied to a holding company that oversaw several corporate investments, one of which was Philip's firm. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the documents at night. She hadn't planned this. But somehow, her growth had placed her in the orbit of the very people Philip tried so hard to impress. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was no longer orbiting him. She was on a path that would soon intersect with his, and not on his terms. The buzz at Philip's firm was electric intense. A senior executive from the holding company was coming to town to evaluate the team and the future of the partnership. Philip obsessed over slide decks and rehearsed introductions in the mirror. "This could make or break my career," he told Natalie one night. "Everything's riding on this." She nodded calmly, hiding the knot in her stomach. She already knew who the executive was, Mr. Simmons, one of the lead partners in Raquel's network. Natalie had seen him speak at a summit Elena invited her to weeks earlier. Meanwhile, Raquel had asked Natalie to join an upcoming dinner with several portfolio founders. Mr. Simmons will be there. He's interested in social tech, she said casually. Natalie hesitated. She knew the name. She knew where he was going. But she also knew she couldn't avoid the moment forever. It wasn't revenge she sought, it was alignment. Her journey had led here. And if the man about to evaluate her husband's worth also respected hers, so be it. She accepted the invitation, knowing full well the paths were about to collide. Natalie arrived at the pre-dinner mixer in a tailored blazer and calm poise. She walked into the event without nerves, but with quiet certainty. Mr. Simmons greeted her warmly. "I've heard your name more than once recently," he said with a firm handshake. "Your platform has real potential." Natalie thanked him, holding his gaze. "It's still early," she said humbly. "But we're seeing real engagement. The need is there." As the conversation grew, other investors joined, curious about the reading tool that was making quiet waves in the education sector. Back at home, Philip was unaware that his world and Natalie's had begun to merge. He was still practicing his opening lines, still polishing his suit. He had no idea that his wife, who he had once mocked in front of peers, was now in direct contact with the people he hoped to impress. Natalie didn't feel smug. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt, most of all, was control. For the first time in years, she held the power of her own narrative, and it no longer lived in his shadow. When Mr. Simmons announced that the next round of company visits would include a private dinner with leadership and family, Philip was elated. "They're flying out the investors next Friday. It'll be huge," he said excitedly. "And this time, you're coming with me." Natalie looked up from her laptop and nodded. "Of course." He didn't notice the flicker in her eyes. To him, it was another dinner, another chance to prove himself. To her, it was the culmination of a slow, deliberate journey back to self-worth. She chose her outfit carefully, elegant, understated, with a confidence that didn't need validation. She didn't tell him she'd already met Simmons. She didn't mention the connection, the praise, or the invitation from Raquel. This dinner wasn't for confrontation, it was for closure. For years, she had swallowed her voice to keep the peace. But now, she wasn't looking for a fight. She was simply going to stand in her truth, and if that truth disrupted the image Philip had curated, so be it. The dinner was held at a private venue overlooking the city skyline. Natalie walked into the room beside Philip, who was buzzing with anticipation. Executives, spouses, and investors mingled, wine glasses in hand, smiles polished. But when Mr. Simmons caught sight of Natalie, his eyes lit up. "Mrs. Cole, what a pleasure," he said, shaking her hand with familiarity. "I didn't know you were Philip's wife." The room shifted slightly. Philip blinked in confusion. "You two know each other?" he asked, trying to mask his surprise. Mr. Simmons smiled. "Of course. She's leading one of our most promising new ventures." The silence around the table grew dense. Philip's colleagues turned to stare. Natalie, calm and composed, met her husband's eyes. "You didn't ask what I've been working on," she said gently. "So I didn't tell you." Philip's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The dynamic had changed. And everyone in that room knew it. For the first time, Natalie wasn't introduced as someone's wife. She was introduced as someone who mattered on her own terms. Philip remained motionless for several seconds, as if his brain couldn't process what had just unfolded. His colleagues whispered to each other, eyes flicking between him and Natalie. She remained composed, sipping water as if nothing had happened. Mr. Simmons continued speaking with her, asking detailed questions about her platform and future goals. No one was paying attention to Philip anymore. The spotlight he had long chased was no longer his. It had quietly shifted to the woman he had publicly belittled, dismissed, and underestimated for years. A junior executive leaned toward Philip and muttered, "Your wife's the one behind LitPath?" "I heard the holding company doubled down on that investment." Philip nodded stiffly, managing a thin smile. But inside, panic swirled. He had never asked what Natalie did with her time. He had assumed she had no ambition, no capability. Now, the hierarchy he had built so carefully, where he stood above her, was unraveling in front of everyone. And he couldn't stop it. Dinner continued, but the mood had changed. Conversations shifted toward innovation, impact, and Natalie's app. Mr. Simmons invited her to speak about the platform's development, and she did so with poise. "It began as an idea I shelved for years," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Then someone reminded me I still had something valuable to offer." Her voice was soft, but the impact was sharp. The room quieted, each word landing with weight. Philip stared at his plate, silent, the utensils in his hand untouched. Natalie didn't embellish. She spoke plainly, sharing both the technical and emotional journey. Access to information shouldn't depend on zip code or income. "My team is building something that gives families what I once didn't have, a way back into opportunity." Polite applause followed, but the subtext was clear: her presence wasn't just a formality. She was a force. Philip clapped too, his hands slow and disconnected from his expression. He couldn't escape the truth. She wasn't a background character in his story anymore. She had become the story. After dinner, small groups formed. Natalie drifted naturally into conversations with investors and board members, answering questions with clarity and humility. Philip stood awkwardly at the edge, no longer the center of attention. One of the senior partners approached him with a stiff smile. "Quite the surprise," he said. "Your wife's done something impressive. You should have told us." Philip nodded again, offering a half-hearted chuckle. "She keeps to herself," he said, but it sounded hollow even to him. Someone asked Mr. Simmons how they discovered LitPath. He glanced toward Natalie and replied, "We've been watching her work for months. She's one of the smartest investments we've made in this cycle." The silence after his words was telling. A few guests glanced at Philip, unsure how to reconcile the image they had of him with the reality now unfolding. Natalie wasn't just adjacent to success. She was now part of the structure that determined it. And Philip, for once, had no place to hide behind. That night, at home, Philip didn't speak. He went straight to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. Natalie walked in calmly, removed her earrings, and placed them on the nightstand. The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his voice low. Natalie folded her blazer over a chair. "Because every time I tried to talk about my ideas, you made them sound small. So I stopped offering them to you." His jaw tensed. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. Natalie turned to him, eyes steady. "No. I didn't embarrass you. I existed without your permission, and that made you uncomfortable. Her voice was firm but not cruel. There was no triumph in her tone, only truth. You're not the man I married anymore, she continued. And maybe I'm not the woman you remember either. But that's not my shame to carry. Days passed. Philip remained cold, passive, and distant. He didn't ask about her meetings or her platform. Instead, he buried himself in work, though even that began to show cracks. Rumors at his firm pointed toward restructuring. New leadership was being discussed. And people remembered the dinner. They remembered how Natalie was welcomed, how Philip was silenced. His image had dulled. And he knew it. But still, the apology never came. Not for the jokes, not for the years of condescension, not for the night he called her a parasite. Natalie stopped waiting. Instead, she kept moving. Each morning, she met with her team. Each afternoon, she reviewed reports. Her name was now printed in business publications, her app reviewed on platforms she had once only read about. The world was noticing her. And she no longer needed Philip to do the same. One morning, Natalie stood by the kitchen window, watching the soft morning light spill over the counter. Her phone buzzed with an invitation to speak at a national education conference. She stared at it, unmoving. Behind her, Philip entered the room, grabbed his coffee, and left without a word. The distance between them had grown into something permanent, cold, immovable. She realized then that the silence between them wasn't temporary. It was a choice he had made long before she did. That afternoon, she emailed a realtor. She looked at a small apartment not far from the city's creative hub. It was nothing extravagant, just clean, bright, and hers. That evening, she packed a single suitcase. Philip walked in as she zipped it closed. "Where are you going?" he asked. She didn't raise her voice. "I'm going somewhere I can breathe." He looked stunned, as if it never occurred to him that she could leave. But she was already gone, even before she stepped out the door. Natalie's new apartment was modest, with bare walls and second-hand furniture. But it was full of light, and more importantly, freedom. She filled it slowly, one plant, one framed photo, one quiet night at a time. She worked late into the evenings, answering emails, refining strategy, and mentoring other female founders online. Each day she felt lighter, more present in her own skin. The life she was building had weight now, not because it was heavy, but because it was real. She met with school boards, pitched new district contracts, and expanded Litpatha's reach. Her calendar filled with events and meetings she once only dreamed of attending. One night, she stood in front of a room full of educators and policymakers and told her story, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "I was invisible for a long time. I stayed small because it made others comfortable. But the truth is, shrinking never protected me. It only delayed who I was meant to be." Meanwhile, news broke quietly in business circles. Philip had been removed from his team. Restructuring, they said. Some speculated it was performance. Others whispered it had to do with internal politics. He sat at home now, checking emails that never came, interviews that went nowhere. The confidence he had once carried like a suit of armor had rusted. He heard Natalie's name in podcasts, read it in editorials. She was no longer his wife. She was a leader. A builder. A story people wanted to hear. He thought about calling her. Just to talk. Maybe even to apologize. But what would he say? That he didn't see her until everyone else did? That he had mistaken silence for simplicity? He closed his laptop and sat alone at the table where once they had shared dinner. But now, only the sound of the refrigerator humming kept him company. He had waited too long. And she was never coming back. Months later, they crossed paths at a fundraising gala. Natalie was a keynote speaker. Philip had come with a former colleague. When he saw her on stage, he barely recognized the woman who once waited by the door for him to come home. Her voice was steady, her presence radiant. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Power clung to her not in volume, but in confidence. After the speech, he approached her carefully. "Natalie," he began. She turned, polite but unreadable. "You look well," he said. "Truly." She smiled, distant but kind. "Thank you." He hesitated. "I was wrong. About a lot of things." She nodded. "I know." For a moment, he thought she might offer something more. Forgiveness. A second chance. But instead, she simply said, "Take care of yourself," and walked away. He watched her go, a woman finally unburdened. He had lost her not because she changed, but because he never saw who she was to begin with. That night, Natalie returned home to her apartment, kicked off her heels, and sat on the floor with a cup of tea. The city buzzed softly beyond her window, but inside, all was calm. She looked around the room, simple, filled with books, plants, and pieces of a life she had built with her own hands. She had nothing to prove anymore. Not to a man, not to a room, not even to herself. She picked up a pen and opened a new notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote one sentence: "This is what freedom feels like." She didn't need applause or recognition. What she needed was what she finally had: peace, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The world hadn't given her a seat. She had carved her own table. And now, she sat at the head of it, proud, whole, and completely her own.